My mom was a public and then a private school teacher, and my dad had been interested in homeschooling, and mom always said, no, I'm a public school teacher at heart. But she decided to give it a try, and it worked out really well that first year. In fact, one of the fun things about it was we did U.S. history as a family. Dad participated in that history class because he's Canadian. He had never taken U.S. history. And so it was great that first year, Dad got to be not just a teacher, but a student as well. So yes, they liked homeschooling. I graduated, my brother graduated, and my sister graduated from homeschooling as well, because it worked so well.
Welcome to Homeschool Talks, a podcast by HSLDA. This is a show about all things homeschooling, from practical tips to inspiring stories and everything in between. You can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes, as well as upcoming guests and topics, sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. We're so glad you've joined us today, and we hope you enjoyed the program. Here's your host, Jim Mason.
Hi, I'm Jim Mason, President of Homeschool Legal Defense Association, with another episode of Homeschool Talks. Today I'm talking to a longtime colleague and friend, Darren Jones. He's senior counsel with HSLDA. He's worked here for a very long time and has a lot of great background, history, and stories to tell. Welcome, Darren.
Thank you.
So, Darren, how did you get involved in homeschooling way back in the day?
Yes, well, I was in public high school. This was 1989, and our church put on a panel about raising kids to be Christians. And actually, they had three panels: parents who were sending their kids to public school, parents who had their kids in private school, and parents who were homeschooling. And my parents actually let me play hooky that day. I got to go and watch all the panels and came home and told them, I want to be homeschooled. And so they decided, sure. I only had 2 years left at that point. And so our family started homeschooling. I graduated from homeschooling 2 years later. I was a class of one, had my own graduation ceremony. It was lots of fun.
And were your parents homeschoolers before that or after that?
Yes. Well, not before. They started all three of us kids. I was in grade 11. My brother was going into 9, and my sister was going into grade 4. And they took it just 1 year at a time. They said, this is going to be a 1-year experiment. My mom was a public and then a private school teacher, and my dad had been interested in homeschooling, and mom always said, no, I'm a public school teacher at heart. But she decided to give it a try, and it worked out really well that first year. In fact, one of the fun things about it was we did U.S. history as a family. We used a curriculum for that history where we could all use basically the same textbooks, except they were at different levels. And so we would go around and read basically the middle grade textbook, and my sister could follow along in the younger one, and then we got more information from the older ones. But the fun thing was, Dad participated in that history class because he's Canadian. He had never taken U.S. history. And so it was great that first year, Dad got to be not just a teacher, but a student as well. So yes, they liked homeschooling. I graduated, my brother graduated, and my sister graduated from homeschooling as well, because it worked so well.
So as I recall, when you were being homeschooled, you got to participate in advocacy for homeschooling.
Yes. So that was fun. In grade 11, when we started homeschooling, the New Hampshire law at that point was you had to get approved by your local school board in order to homeschool. And mom and dad actually got denied the first time that they submitted their homeschool plan. They had to spend the next 2 weeks collecting more information, putting together lesson plans for the year, and then they submitted and got approved at that point. But then during that year, there was a bill introduced to make New Hampshire into a, rather than get approved, you file a notice of intent. And so I got to go up and testify in front of the Education Committee for the House. I don't know if you've ever been to New Hampshire's capital. It wears the badge with pride that it has the second biggest House of Representatives in the United States, following only the federal House of Representatives. It's like 400 representatives for a state of under a million population. So that was where we held the hearings because so many homeschoolers showed up that we would start in a little room and then head across the street to the bigger room. So I got to testify at, I think it was the House Education Committee. And then they went on recess. And during that time, the homeschool community did what we called homeschool teas. And we would invite a representative or a senator in to meet with 2 or 3 homeschool families. And I got to talk with several representatives and senators, i.e. neighbors, because, New Hampshire, it's small town still. And then when the bill passed one house, I got to go up and testify in front of the Senate Education Committee. And I found out I like getting up in front of people and talking. And so not only did I get involved in the political process, I got to learn how to stand in front of several hundred people and give a 2 to 3 minute speech. And it was fun. And more importantly, it was successful. The bill passed on that first time.
What year again was that?
So I believe that was 1990. It was either 90 or 91 that it actually passed.
So you started your homeschool advocacy career almost immediately when you started homeschooling.
Yes, that's right. It was the first year that we were homeschooling was when I gave my first speech up there.
And then you graduated from homeschooling, and what did your path look like after that?
So I went to a non-accredited Bible school that was run by our church for 3 years. That was great. We went through the entire Bible in 3 years and also a lot of outside manual labor. And then after that, I went to a Christian liberal arts college for a year. And then there was a homeschool law school by correspondence that was starting up in the mid-90s. And so I dropped out of college and went and applied to that school and got in. And that was in 1995. We have just celebrated our 30-year anniversary of that law school. And that, because it was correspondence, California makes that it's a longer process. So it realistically is 4.5 years. And so I started in 95 and graduated from there in 1999. And
as I recall, you had to have like real world practical experience as well as taking correspondence law courses.
That's right. And that was one of the best things about the program. California required you to do a certain amount of study each day, but you were also expected when you took the bar exam to do what they call the performance exam, which is they give you a file folder basically and say, write a memo, write a letter. So I wanted some practical experience, and there was a job that opened up at HSLDA, a legal assistant job. And so I started here in July of 1996. I had just barely finished my first year of law school. I had taken what is called technically the first year law students examination, but what everyone calls the baby bar. And everyone in the office knew 2 weeks later when I got the call that said I passed the baby bar because I was yelling and screaming in happiness.
And so how did your HSLDA, what did it look like? What did it mean for you to be a legal assistant at HSLDA in 1996?
Well, first of all, interestingly enough, remember I said my dad was interested in homeschooling for a while. Before we ever started homeschooling, I had wanted to be a lawyer since 4th grade. And we were talking about it in middle school. He said, well, there's this organization that's just started a couple of years ago down south somewhere that helps homeschoolers. Maybe it would be cool if you could go work for them. And then we went off and talked about something else. So about 12 years later, I got in touch with Dad and said, hey, guess what? I get to work for HSLDA. So my job as a legal assistant in those days, email was just starting up. Most of my job was on the telephone. During busy season, the busiest day I ever had, I did 75 calls with members and people calling in for advice and things like that. My boss would dictate his letters into a little tape machine, and then I would type out those letters. Eventually, as I got better at it, he would simply say, use this letter that we've done before and draft a copy, something like that for this new district. Also, we were keeping track of legislation in various states, and it was all DOS-based, if any computer nerds out there. So no Windows software for that, for tracking legislation. And the letters that we would send out to state organizations would say, here are bills that we have come across. This one looks good. This one could be problematic. Feel free to call us if we discuss. And then because I worked for a lawyer who had, among other states, North Dakota, I got to listen to him complain every year when North Dakota put some little change in the homeschool law, and he had to fly to North Dakota to testify in January every single year.
I think that back in those days, HSLDA had an intern program. Do you recall anything about the intern program?
Oh, yes, Jim. I recall the intern program. So, yes, we had an intern program where we would bring in 3 to 5 late teens, early 20s homeschool graduates to work in our office, to do work in Washington, D.C., to figure out if they were interested in maybe going to law or going into politics, getting involved in social advocacy. About 6 months after I started here, there was a group of 5 intern girls. And I decided about halfway through that I wanted to marry one of those. However,
you just up and decided you wanted to marry one of them?
Absolutely.
Anyone in particular?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Okay.
I had one of them specifically in mind. She was the one who came along. We had a game night for a lot of the HSLDA singles at that time. One of the staff people every Saturday night would do game night. And so she and I got to meet and interact with each other over games, which we both very much enjoyed. The problem was I still had about 2.5 years of law school left at this point. And so she left and went home, and we corresponded by email some over the next couple of years. I was in good with the HSLDA conference coordinator, and so I would make sure I got sent to the Mississippi conference every year so that I could see her there. And I prayed every night and every morning that she wouldn't get involved with any guys. She told me later she was wondering why she was just being left alone as her friends were getting into dating or courting relationships, and no one showed up for her. So the day after I took my last law school exam, November of 1999, I wrote her family and said, hey, I'm interested in Sarah. Can we get together and maybe get something started? And yes, we did. She came up to visit my parents who were living in Nova Scotia at the time. I was up there studying for the bar exam. She came up to spend a week in Nova Scotia in the wintertime from Mississippi. We've often said we aren't sure that's the best first date to go on is a week up in Nova Scotia. I mean, what if it hadn't gone well? She claims she fell in love with my parents before she fell in love with me. So, yes, I remember the intern program.
So you started out your HSLDA career as a legal assistant. Yep. I see here on this piece of paper that they gave me that you are an attorney now, and that you are the director of group services, and that you've worked on a number of cases over the years. So how did that happen?
Okay. Step 1 is pass the bar exam. And I have a beef with the author John Grisham on this. In a number of his books, that is just one sentence, pass the bar exam. I had to take 8 weeks off work to study for it up in Nova Scotia where there's nothing to do in the winter because I was taking the California bar exam, which at the time prided itself as being the hardest one in the country. It was 3 days, including the performance exam, that I mentioned, where you're supposed to show some skill in law. The second performance exam I did, the very last part of the bar exam, I opened it up. And it was cases about daytime curfews. We had been working on daytime curfews here at HSLDA. My law school buddy who also worked here had done his senior thesis on daytime curfews. I opened it up and was like, I have read every single one of these cases before. It was a wonderful way to end the bar exam. Very confidence boosting. So couple months later, I found out I passed. I flew down 3 days later to propose to my now wife. And then I asked HSLDA, I've been a legal assistant for 4 years. I would like, now that I've passed, to be a lawyer here. And the president at the time, Mike Smith, said, all right, we'll give you 6 months probation to see, will it work? Because they had not done that before. They really hadn't had a brand new lawyer from legal assistant. They'd hired a couple brand new ones, but mostly they were looking for more experienced ones. And so I took on a few states, did not have a legal assistant. I wrote all the letters myself. I researched the issues. I went up and down the hallway talking to other lawyers who had these states before, so I knew I wasn't making mistakes. And after 6 months, I guess I passed my probation. I can't remember actually officially getting notice, but that was the year 2000.
We should look into that, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
I need to talk to the president.
So that was, I got to be a lawyer. I got to hire a legal assistant after 6 months, which that was an interesting experience. He's now the godparent to one of my sons. And then after a year or so of doing what we call contact work, writing letters to school districts, tracking legislation, being basically responsible for a few states, I transferred to the litigation department, which had a new head of litigation who just come in a few months before named James Mason. So I moved offices.
So this is now becoming more clear to me.
Yes.
So apparently before your probationary period ended, you found a new job, and so they didn't actually look into it. Is that kind of what happened?
I think you could probably describe it that way. Yes. I had looked at maybe doing litigation, maybe, a year later or something. But no, in December, one of the lawyers stopped by my office and said, I would like to transfer out of litigation back to contact. Would you be interested? Sure. Sounds good. And so that was really what I did for the next, technically I still do some litigation. I was in Ohio last week on a case. But that was my primary job for 15 years or so. And so I got to work on all sorts of interesting cases, meet interesting people. We can talk some about that, but let me just finish up with, then I started doing more talking with groups, helping them design policies, think about, what do we want for statements of faith? And then 2000 hit, and that has become my primary main job now for the last 5 years, is helping homeschool groups.
2020?
Sorry, 2020. What did I say?
You said 2000, which
no.
I'm pretty sure that wasn't right.
No, that was not right. It is 2020.
Yeah, let's talk about that transition because you've been in a position really since high school to see homeschooling kind of go through different phases. And with your current role as the director of group services, put that into context.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when I was being homeschooled, some of my favorite memories of homeschooling were being in a homeschool co-op. There were 6 or 7 families in our church who, because of that church panel, had decided that year, we're going to try homeschooling, see how it works. And they got together in the summer and decided, we've got 12, 13 kids who are basically grades 3 to 11. Let's try and get together once or twice a week to do stuff together. And so we did classes together like geography. My mom taught public speaking. We did a class on great battles, and the guy who taught that was a fan of the English, and so all the battles we studied were ones where the English had won. Also where I found out that Shakespeare is awesome, because we got to watch some of a new movie that had just come out, Henry V, starring Kenneth Branagh. So we did that. It was 2 days a week that first year, Monday and Wednesday afternoons, and then the parents decided, that is too much, because the families lived 45 minutes to an hour apart, and trying to get everyone together twice a week. So they just went down to once a week. Still doing activities, not really any core subjects. We wrote a play and put it on. We did physical education, stuff that works better in groups. And so in the 2000s, as I was a lawyer and then starting to talk with groups, it was mostly three types of groups that I talked to. There was your support group, and that one's aimed more at parents. Getting together once a month to pray for each other, maybe doing a mom's night out, maybe a group that focused on field trips. And then there was the co-ops, and those were more, they were parents cooperating together to teach classes. Maybe one was really gifted in math, and so she would teach a math class. Maybe someone was a chef, and so he would teach a cooking class. But the co-ops, and then there's the state organizations, the ones that work in the legislature, that answer the phone calls for new homeschoolers about how do I do this? So those were really kind of the three groups that I was interacting with. And then in the mid-teens or so, I started seeing a lot of groups that called themselves homeschool co-ops, but were looking more like private schools. And so the first time I saw this, I was down in Texas to do some workshops at a conference. And we met at a church that, on the weekends was a church with lots of Sunday school rooms. And on the week was open 5 days a week for homeschool classes. And some of the classes ran 5 days a week. So you could take English from 9 to 10 every morning. Or you could take history Monday and Thursday. Or you could come in for science on Wednesday and then science lab on Friday. But the building was open the entire time. And some of the teachers were parents and some of them weren't. And then I started seeing more groups like this coming up. And then when 2020 hit and the entire country went to some sort of schooling at home, a lot of these groups, some of them became really big. Some of the co-ops, for example, who were already teaching English classes or drama or things that parents who were new to this thought, well, I can't do that. Oh, here's a co-op that meets a couple times a week. A lot of my job those first year and a half or so was talking to these groups about what are the COVID policies for your state and your county, and how can you creatively comply with them, we'll say. But after all the schools reopened, a lot of what I would say hybrid programs started up. And I was actually just at the 4th National Hybrid Schools Conference down in Atlanta. And everything from homeschool co-ops that operate, one afternoon a week, to groups that are operating a charter school 4 days a week, and everything in between. And a lot of them call themselves homeschoolers because they are based out of their home and the parents have a lot of say in what's going on. They help choose curriculum. A lot of them view themselves as homeschooling, even though their kids are meeting together somewhere else a couple days a week. So it's been a change in terminology, but also a change in what is actually happening. And when I go to the hybrid conference and when I'm talking to people about starting up stuff, I'm an advocate for homeschooling. I make no bones about it, and I try and push them toward kind of what I had, the co-op that meets once or twice a week that is assisting the parents to homeschool their kids. Because I honestly think that's what works best in the homeschool movement.
So in that biography, you worked on some cases.
Yes.
What was the most memorable case that you worked on that you can talk about?
Okay, yes. So probably the most memorable one, because it lasted several years long, was in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania at the time had one of the most restrictive laws in the country, and there were some families who wanted to challenge the law based on their religious convictions. Pennsylvania had just recently passed the Religious Freedom Protection Act, RFPA. And so these families said, well, the homeschool law as it's written pretty much gives the superintendent the final say over whether I am allowed to homeschool my kids. And so I was involved in that one, from interviewing families that got in touch with us who wanted to challenge it, helping draft complaints. We started one, I believe, in state court, and then all the rest got moved up to federal court and eventually were combined into one case. I got to go and visit with the families. I got to do depositions of superintendents and school officials. I got to sit with the families as they were deposed, and lawyers who had no idea how homeschooling worked were trying to figure out how these families taught their kids. And it was all over the state. There was one family that was almost on the New Jersey border, and then there was another family north of Pittsburgh. There were a couple in the central. So that one was memorable to me because I got to meet a lot of really neat homeschool families. And, it was fighting about homeschooling. Some of the cases that I do, they're interesting, and, but it's like, trying to get child support benefits extended past age 18 for the next 6 months because I'm homeschooling. That's the one I was up in Ohio last week. That's good and it's important and valuable, but this one was kind of fighting for the right to homeschool. And so that one to me was very memorable.
Yeah, and that case sort of ended when Pennsylvania changed the law.
Yes, exactly.
Removed a lot of those restrictions.
Yes.
So why do we do cases like the child support case?
Well, there are a couple reasons. Number one,
well, first let's set it up. What is it about? I mean, there's a whole variety of cases. This one is sort of an example of Social Security and other things.
Yeah. So there's Social Security, there's veterans benefits, there's child support benefits, but the thing that they all have in common is when the child turns a particular age, either 16 or 18, there are benefits that are cut off unless the child is still enrolled in school. And so the question is a child who is in a homeschool program actually enrolled in school? And so we started doing this one back in the early 2000s when a family who was getting Social Security benefits for a parent who had died got in touch with us and said, Social Security is telling us they're going to cut our benefits 5 months before my child graduates from 12th grade because, they're 18 now. And so we started getting involved and fighting for the proposition that homeschooling is schooling. And Social Security took a while to kind of get on board, but eventually, through a combination of us doing cases at the low level and doing lobbying at the federal level, that right now Social Security actually has specific guidelines for every single state. If you are homeschooling in Virginia and you want to extend benefits, your local office should be asking you for notice of intent and standardized testing results, or letter that, you're religiously exempt. Although, okay, we won't go down that rabbit trail. But
I guess the fundamental reason was that these state agencies were saying that homeschooling was not a valid form of education, even though it was legal and people were doing it in accordance with the law of their state.
Yep.
And so we did a big variety of these with Social Security and veterans benefits.
And the veterans was, in one way, the most successful, but also the hardest fought because the Veterans Administration has taken a very dim view of correspondence schooling since just after World War II. And there was actually an official military attorney general's opinion from 1998 that homeschooling was not an educational institution for any purpose at all, including for veterans benefits to continue after the child turns 18. We actually went to court on that one and had to fight through several levels. Started out in Wisconsin and then eventually ended up here in DC at the Veterans Court of Appeals, where we won. And since that time period, now most of our work on that, as with Social Security, is reminding the VA, reminding Social Security of their own policies and the fact that homeschooling is schooling for the purpose of these benefits. You can't just say, oh, well, that's homeschooling. It doesn't count. Yes, it does.
Let me tell the war story about the Veterans Appeals case. I was the one that argued that case in the Veterans Court of is it claims or appeals? Veterans Court of Appeals in downtown DC. And they rarely had oral argument, but it was a 3-judge panel. And it's a weird court because it's not an Article 3 court, meaning the judges are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. It's an Article 2 court. It's part of the executive branch. And this 3-judge panel rarely meets because most cases are submitted kind of on briefs. And so I showed up and they were all very excited. And I didn't know this, but the bailiff gave me a tour prior to the argument because I got there pretty early. And he said, oh, and here's the chambers and here's this modern, place where we do argument. And oh, by the way, today, all of the counsel from all of the regions of the VA are here. And they're going to be in the gallery watching this oral argument. And we have this really modern system where the argument is going to be on CCTV in every veteran's office in the country. And I'm like, oh no, why did you tell me this? I showed up to this empty courtroom. A lot of times you go to oral argument at an appeals court and there's nobody there. It's just you and 3 judges and another lawyer. And so I actually had to give oral argument to the whole world, which turned out to be pretty successful. I will say that one of the judges really got our case. And it's one of the things that when you're in front of a 3-judge panel, having one of the judges actually advocate for your side is always a good thing. But anyway, that was my war story from that case.
Yes. And
we ended up winning that case, which then set that was the precedent-setting case that makes the Veterans Administration a little more friendly to our arguments. Although you get to handle all of the original claims.
Yes.
So, are we still fighting with them?
We are. There was a family down in Oklahoma where we had filed paperwork, I think, back in January. And nothing happened for several months. So we sent them a nice tickler letter reminding them that this existed, and just got word last week that the benefits had been reinstated, as they should have been. I mean, the law is clear on this one.
Yeah, and this is a very satisfying part of what we do. Just last week, in one of our Social Security cases, where these things it's still a bureaucracy, and you still have local offices, and there's still kind of disputes. But one of our families just got kind of back pay reinstated of like $14,000 in benefits. So it's we're the only law firm I know of in America that will help homeschool families, and our members get our help with because they're our members. And,
yes.
And that's a really great thing that we do. Well, let's just go to the other aspect of your work here, being involved in legislation.
Okay.
What happened this year? Is there anything memorable that people would like to hear about from this year?
Yes, it was a really
That's
really
sort of a softball question, Darren.
Oh, isn't it though?
So here we go.
This year was busy for legislation, and not necessarily in places where it's normally. I cover Mississippi. We always know that Mississippi is going to have a lot of bills that might tangentially affect homeschooling introduced, because the way they do it down there, they don't have co-sponsors. So there's tons of bills, but mostly it's monitoring, and the state organization down there has very good relationships, and stuff behind the scenes happens, and things get fixed, which is very nice.
So your predecessor, who was monitoring Mississippi, was sort of old school, and mountains and mountains of paper from Mississippi bills would get printed out and sent to the office for that kind of manual review. Are you still doing that in Mississippi?
No, thankfully I am not. Websites are great for that. Especially Mississippi actually has a very nice system where you can go in and it'll show you here are the new parts and here are the old parts. And if you want, you can download them as PDFs. And yes, I have very occasionally printed them out, but thankfully, no, I'm not doing the mountains of paper that I used to have to print out for D and bring in. But this year we had a lot of legislative activity in, for example, Virginia, which I live here in Virginia. This was one that I that I saw. There are two options for homeschooling in Virginia. There's the notice of intent and do an assessment at the end of the year. And then there's, I have a religious objection to sending my kids to public school, and therefore I am exempt from the compulsory attendance law. This was a law passed back in the 70s. Well, this year, there was a bill introduced that it wouldn't technically have abolished religious exemption. It just would have put the same requirements on religious exemption as exist in the notice statute. And there were a number of people who objected to this, like, everyone at HSLDA, for example. But this was a hard-fought fight. We had to have homeschoolers show up at the Capitol to give testimony. There had to be a lot of going and visiting senators and representatives behind the scenes. Thankfully, that bill did die in committee. But that was a fight. We haven't had to do a legislative fight like that in Virginia for a number of years. One that got that much attention. Another example is Illinois, which has been having a real hard fight this time. And Illinois right now is a state where it's very easy to homeschool. They have a very nice court case from back a while ago that basically recognized a parent teaching their child as a private school. And since it's just, the one family at home, there's really not a whole lot of paperwork that you have to do to start up your own private school. It's one of 12 or 13 states around the country that does homeschool is a private school. But a new bill was introduced in Illinois that would have turned it into a state where there was notice, there was oversight, there would be hoops and gates to jump through before you were allowed to homeschool, and then there would be monitoring of the homeschooling. Illinois hadn't had a fight like this on homeschooling in years, and the homeschool community in Illinois really turned out. They had, at one point for the hearings, they had buses situated north of the Capitol and south of the Capitol because there's not really much parking around the Capitol itself. And so you go and park in a parking lot and get on a bus and be bussed into the Capitol to either give testimony or just be there wearing a particular color shirt in some states, or signs, but signs aren't often allowed nowadays, but to be there to register their opposition to the bill. Thankfully, at this point, it looks like the bill in its current form is dead. However, the problem is sometimes you call them zombie bills. There are times when we have seen a bill die and then the language of it gets smacked into another bill that's flying through, and nobody knows about it, except the legislatures who are doing the voting. So we are keeping a careful eye on that one, but that one has taken a lot of man hours here at the office because there's the work of the attorney team Will has put in hours flying back and forth and writing testimony and writing alerts to people. The state organization has been sending out videos every week or so, letting people know what's up. Because I wasn't necessarily involved in that, it was kind of fun to watch. It was like going back to New Hampshire when I was a homeschool student.
Yeah, and it's been an interesting, as we record this, the Illinois legislative session is still open for a couple more weeks. And so we are still monitoring it. But it's been interesting to see how homeschooling has changed over the years, because part of the coalition that opposed this bill came from Chicago, where a lot of families who maybe didn't homeschool in the past, especially Black families, had discovered homeschooling, especially during COVID and since COVID, where homeschooling amongst Black families has grown enormously over the last few years. And so there was a real kind of bipartisan kind of opposition, because a lot of the families who had discovered homeschooling came from varying political backgrounds, but all supporting the right of parents to homeschool without all this unnecessary paperwork added.
One of my favorite memories of something like that was a few years ago in California, there was a bill introduced that would have added some extra paperwork to what California now requires. And California didn't particularly appreciate that. And so I got to fly out to give, they had open testimony, but there were so many people there that testimony consisted of, there were 3 or 4 people who were allowed to talk for a couple minutes. And then everyone else had to get in a line at the microphone and stand up and say their name, who they were representing and how many folks, and whether they supported or opposed the bill. That went on for, I believe, 3 3/4 hours. It almost hit the 4-hour mark with just people saying that. And I saw families that, could have been out of the late 80s, early 90s with many children and mom and dad both there. And then there were a couple with, 2 moms there. Their family was opposing it. And a couple families where they had pink mohawks on, and absolutely they were opposed to this. And teenagers like me standing up saying, I represent our homeschool co-op. They sent me, for 25 families to oppose it. It was awesome to see all these different people who might not have agreed on a whole lot of stuff, but what they did agree on was homeschooling is good. And one of the reasons it's good is it's free.
Mm-hmm. And one of the cases you and I worked on years ago in California, it was a similar event where a surprise Court of Appeals ruling held that homeschooling in California, which was being done by tens of thousands of families, was actually illegal, and it always had been. And as we worked with different groups, one of the amicus briefs, a friend of the court brief, written on behalf of 3 organizations. One was the Christian Homeschoolers, Christian Home Educators Association,
California. Yep.
And the other was one of the other parties on the same brief.
Yes, was
a very secular group who did not have religious convictions about homeschooling, but they joined this brief because they shared the same values in keeping homeschooling free, and in that case, restoring it to a legal status after this court ruling. So, Darren, I think that we should end with you and Sarah were both homeschooled, and you, I think, eventually had some children.
We did, yes.
And you sent them to the local public school, right?
No, actually, I'm not quite even sure which local school they would have gone to. No, we actually decided that we were going to at least start homeschooling because it had worked well for me my last 2 years. I really liked it, got a good education. Sarah had been homeschooled all through high school, and she's a writer, and she had been able to work with her mom and other teachers to really improve her writing. So she liked homeschooling. So we started off, and we've got 4 kids. And we have graduated 3 of them from homeschooling. One is he's finishing up his 10th grade year this year. It has worked well for us. My other son is graduating with his associates in computer science in just a couple days from when we're filming this. One of my other daughters, both of them are taking college classes, and it's one of the things that I liked about being homeschooled. Our family had always been pretty close, but homeschooling brought us closer. And that's worked with our family too. I have kids who like each other and who are happy when I come home at night and we hang around the living room laughing together. And it can get pretty loud sometimes, especially with some of my middle kids. Homeschooling's just plain worked well for us. And we've been involved in several different co-ops, some of them more on the academic side. I have actually taught a class in Great Battles there, kind of like I took when I was in. And then one that we called the Homeschool Hangout Co-op, where literally, as I was teaching the class, if kids got bored, they could go wander the hallways, find another class, go play in the gym. That fit our family vibe very, very well. And yeah, we've graduated 3 now.
And I recall our magazine is called The Court Report that we send out to our members 3 or 4 times a year. One of my favorite Court Report cover stories was written by you and your involvement as a dad in the homeschooling.
Yes. Well, I will clarify, as the byline said, it was a team effort, as our homeschooling is, between Sarah and me. Sarah did a lot of the early years homeschooling, although I would usually take what we called February school. She would take a break for a month, and I'd do a unit study with the kids. We did Egypt, we did Greek mythology at one point. But as they got older into middle school, we divided up more evenly. So, for example, I choose the curriculum. I run it by Sarah, but I'm the one who does the research and talks with the high school kids to make sure they're okay with it. And that's part of my job. And then I do the lesson plans. I've actually still got lesson planning books, written in 4 colors because 4 kids down in my office. That was my Sunday afternoon for years, was sitting down for 2 or 3 hours and writing out their assignments for the coming week. And then I would do some of the assignments, especially history. I love history. As the kids got older, it was my job to sign them up for the online classes, which I just did for my 10th to be 11th grade son yesterday. Got him signed up with a couple. Sarah does the implementing, which works better because I am the structure, and it throws me for a loop when something gets off schedule. And Sarah's much more flexible and can go with the flow. So it has worked out well for us. I think it's worked out well for our kids too. I mean, they see that mom and dad are both invested in this.
Well, Darren, thanks for joining me for this conversation today. And if you're out there wondering about establishing a homeschool group of any kind, Darren is here at HSLDA to help you with some really, really good fundamental ways of getting your group organized. And if you have other questions, other issues, please consider joining HSLDA. You can find out how to do that at Homeschool Legal Defense website at hslda.org. We'd love to have you as a member of HSLDA to help your family in your homeschooling journey, but also Darren was talking about the legislative battles that we fought this year in Virginia and Illinois. And we think that's these are things that are going to be happening more consistently in the future as homeschooling is coming under scrutiny in some ways that it hasn't in the past. And when you join HSLDA, you help us, even if your state's not having a battle this year, you help us be able to help the states that are. So thanks again, Darren. And once again, I'm Jim Mason, President of Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and we're so glad you could join us for this episode of Homeschool Talks.
Today's episode is made possible by HSLDA's Generation Joshua program. Do you have a student who wants to make a difference in our nation? Generation Joshua empowers teens to make the most of their citizenship through local clubs, immersive simulations, online courses, and real-life campaign experiences. For more information, visit generationjoshua.org. That's generationjoshua.org. Thanks for listening to this episode of Homeschool Talks. If you've enjoyed this conversation, will you do us a favor by sharing it with a friend or leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts? As a reminder, you can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes, as well as upcoming guests and topics, you can sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. That's all for now. We hope you enjoyed this program, and we'll see you next time.